For our final lecture, we move from ethical leadership to ethical institutions. The central question is, how do we build institutions that remain ethical even when individual leaders change? This is important because leadership is temporary. Every president, mayor, secretary, director, or administrator eventually leaves. The real measure of leadership is whether good practices continue after the leader is gone. So we're not simply asking, how can I become an ethical leader? We are asking, how can ethical leadership become ethical governance? To be able to do that, let's look very quickly at the learning outcomes of these 65 slides. So the slide summarizes what we want to accomplish. We will connect the four major ideas of the course: ethics, power, leadership, and governance. We will distinguish ethical leadership from ethical governance and examine public trust, legitimacy, accountability, and institutional integrity. We will also consider newer challenges such as digital governance, AI, surveillance, and automated decision making. The practical goal is simple. How do we design institutions where ethical behavior is supported by the system itself? Let's look at the journey that we have been throughout the course. Uh, Week 1, ethics, we ask what makes public action right or wrong using Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Rawls, and the distinction between legality and morality. Week 2, power. We examined how power actually operates through hierarchy, expertise, surveillance, institutions, and narratives. Week 3, leadership. We ask how people should exercise power through practical wisdom, discretion, servant leadership, and adaptive leadership. Now, week 4, governance. Our question becomes, how do good leaders create good institutions? The progression is important. You need to be able to see uh, the relationship. Uh, Ethics tells us what ought to be done. Power gives us the capacity to act. Leadership concerns how we exercise that power, and governance determines whether good practice becomes institutional. We need to understand that a good leader eventually leaves. An ethical institution must remain. Many organizations function well because one strong leader is present. But when that person leaves, the system collapses. That tells us that the organization depended on the person rather than the institution. So one measure of good leadership is this: if I leave tomorrow, will the good practices continue? If transparency, accountability, professionalism, and fairness disappear, when the leader disappears, then these values were never fully institutionalized. Here we need to distinguish ethical leadership from ethical governance. Ethical leadership concerns the character and conduct of the person exercising authority. Ethical governance concerns the quality of the entire system in which authority is exercised. A mayor, governor, secretary, or director can be personally honest while operating within weak procurement systems. Patronage networks, politicized appointments, or ineffective oversight. So ethical leadership asks, is the leader ethical? Ethical governance asks, does the institution make ethical action easier and unethical action more difficult regardless of who leads? That is the key insight. We need good people, but good government cannot depend only on good people. We also need good systems. What ethical governance requires? Ethical governance goes beyond having virtuous leaders. It requires structures that support ethical behavior and make abuse more difficult. The slide identifies 5 requirements: reward integrity, prevent abuse, expose wrongdoing, enable participation, and correct errors. The insight here is that institutions should not depend on everyone always making the right choice. Audits, checks, whistleblower protection, participation, and review mechanisms exist because human beings are fallible. Good governance helps good people do good and makes wrongdoing harder to hide. This leads us to, what is governance? And you'd see that we need to distinguish government from governance. Government refers primarily to formal political institutions. Governance is broader. It concerns how collective decisions are made, implemented, monitored, and evaluated. Governance, therefore, involves government agencies, courts, elected officials, civil servants, citizens, civil society, media, professional organizations, businesses, and even international institutions. A public health crisis illustrates these very well. No single agency can manage it alone. So governance is fundamentally about relationships and coordination among different actors. But we also need to understand how good governance is not simply efficient governance. Efficiency matters because public resources are limited. Waste is itself an ethical problem. But efficiency alone does not make governance good. A dictatorship may be efficient. A corrupt system may complete projects quickly. An efficient agency may still violate people's rights. Good governance, therefore, balances several values: justice and equity, transparency and accountability, legality and integrity, responsiveness, and effectiveness. Sometimes these values conflict. Consultation may slow a project, for example, but speed cannot always be more important than participation. So the ethical question is not simply, did we do it quickly, but also, did we do it fairly and properly? When we start talking about fair and proper, there's a fundamental presumption on that: public trust. Public trust means that citizens believe institutions are competent, fair, honest, predictable, responsive, and oriented toward public welfare. An important distinction here is that trust does not require agreement. I can disagree with a government policy and still trust the institution if I believe that the process was fair, evidence was considered, reasons were explained, and people were heard. This means that government should not measure trust simply by asking whether citizens support every decision. Agreement is political. Trust is institutional. Now, let's look at concerns of trust and legitimacy. Legitimacy means believing that government has not simply the power to govern, but the right to govern. When trust declines, several consequences follow. Compliance decreases, cynicism grows, misinformation spreads more easily, and corruption may gradually become normalized. The slide gives us a especially useful insight. Trust is not merely public relations capital, it is administrative capacity. A trusted government can ask citizens to cooperate with difficult policies more effectively because citizens believe that institutions are acting legitimately. So how does government lose trust? Trust is not always destroyed by one enormous scandal. Often it disappears through accumulated small betrayals. The slide identifies broken promises, corruption and patronage, concealment, inconsistency, and impunity. Perhaps the most damaging is hypocrisy. Government demands standards from citizens that officials themselves refuse to follow. For example, when rules are strictly enforced against ordinary citizens but ignored for politically connected people, the damage goes beyond that particular case. The institution teaches citizens that rules are not really rules. They actually depend on who you are, and that destroys trust. But there's also a question on procedural justice. Citizens judge government not only according to what was decided, but also according to how the decision was made. The slide gives four simple questions. Was I heard? Was the decision impartial? Were reasons given? Was I treated respectfully? This is a this is procedural justice. Sometimes government cannot give everyone the outcome they want, but it can ensure that people receive a fair process. This is particularly important in taxation, law enforcement, licensing, public benefits, and disciplinary cases. People may accept an unfavorable decision if they believe the process was genuinely fair. That's the reason why we also need to raise the question of accountability as answerability. We often think accountability simply means punishment, but the slide gives us a better definition. Accountability begins with answerability, the obligation to explain the exercise of public authority. A public official should be able to say, I exercise public authority, therefore I must explain what I did and why. This requires documentation, transparent records, audits, oversight, remedies, and responsiveness to findings. Punishment may eventually be necessary, but punishment is only one possible consequence of accountability. The first requirement is give an account of your actions. Accountability operates in terms of two directions. Vertical accountability is citizens to government, whereas And that includes elections, public opinion, media, civic organizations, and citizen participation make leaders answerable to the governed. Horizontal accountability is institutions to institutions, courts, commissions, legislatures, auditors, ombudsmen, and internal controls check other institutions. We need both. Election alone are not enough because elections happen periodically. Government exercises power every day. So democratic accountability means not only citizens checking leaders, but also institutions checking institutions. And that leads us to concerns of transparency and its limits. Transparency means that public decisions can be explained, but simply uploading thousands of pages of documents does not necessarily produce meaningful transparency. The slide calls this symbolic transparency, appearing open without actually making information usable. Genuine transparency requires information that is accessible, understandable, timely, relevant, and usable. But transparency also has limits. Government has legitimate duties involving privacy, confidentiality, security, diplomacy, and personal data. So the principle is not absolute openness, but justified openness. A useful ethical question is, are we withholding this information because disclosure would genuinely cause harm, or because disclosure would embarrass us? That distinction is essential to ethical governance. Let's look at another question, and here we see the question of integrity. The word comes from integritas, meaning wholeness. For an individual, integrity means that what I publicly claim and what I actually do are consistent. For an institution, the same principle applies. An agency may say, we believe in merit, but if promotions are based on patronage, there is institutional incoherence. So integrity is not merely about avoiding corruption. It means bringing institutional practice into alignment with institutional values. But we cannot speak of integrity without talking about integrity systems. Integrity cannot depend only on personal goodness. Institutions need systems that support integrity. The slide identifies codes of conduct, disclosure requirements, procurement safeguards, internal audits, whistleblower protection, conflict of interest policies, ombudsman mechanisms, ethics committees, transparent recruitment, independent oversight, performance review, and public access mechanisms. The principle is simple. Design the organization so that integrity is supported structurally. We do not create these systems because everyone is corrupt. We create them because everyone is fallible. This leads us to checks, balances, and the separation of person from office. Here we encounter an important principle of public administration. The office is not the person. Public authority is held in trust. The budget, vehicles, personnel, equipment, and other resources belong to the public, not to whoever temporarily occupies the position. Institutional decay begins when officials personalize the office. Government resources become my resources. Employee become my people, and public authority becomes personal authority. Checks and balances, therefore, protect not only against bad leaders, but also against the natural temptation to confuse public office with personal possession. But let's also look at the concern of patronage and corruption citizenship. Patronage occurs when public resources and opportunities are distributed according to personal loyalty rather than merit or legal entitlement. This can happen in appointments, contracts, permits, scholarships, benefits, or access to government services. But notice the deeper problem. Patronage changes the relationship between citizen and government. Instead of saying, I have a right to this service, the citizen begins saying, I need someone powerful to help me. Citizens become clients of politicians rather than rights-bearing members of the political community. And here you see also the promise and scrutiny that goes with meritocracy. Merit systems are important because public administration requires competence. Citizens deserve a government that knows what it is doing. But the slide also asks us to examine merit critically. Who defines merit? What criteria are being used? Are some groups unfairly excluded? Can decisions be reviewed? So, meritocracy is not simply about examinations, credentials, or rankings. A good merit system must itself be transparent, relevant, fair, and open to contestation. Let's deepen this understanding further by looking at, again, an understanding of the common good in terms of equality and equity. Equality and equity are related but different. Equality emphasizes the same rules and treatment. Equity recognizes that people may begin from different circumstances and therefore may require different forms of support to achieve genuine fairness. The slide then connects this to the common good. The common good is not simply whatever the majority wants. It refers to the social conditions that allow people and communities to flourish together: justice, peace, education, healthcare, participation, environmental sustainability, and institutional trust. When looking at these things, we cannot ignore Mark Moore's concept of public value that changes the question we ask about government. Instead of asking only, are we efficient? We ask, what value are we creating for citizens? Public value includes things that cannot easily be measured financially: justice, access, trust, legitimacy, safety, dignity, and inclusion. This is why government cannot be managed exactly like a private corporation. Profit can be measured financially, but public value is broader. Let's push this further by looking at policy ethics. Every public policy contains ethical choices. Tax policy makes decisions about fairness. Healthcare policy determines priorities. Criminal justice policy makes judgments about punishment. Therefore, public policy is never completely morally neutral. Every policy distributes something: benefits, burdens, risks, and opportunities. The ethical administrator should therefore ask, who benefits? Who bears the burden? Who assumes the risk? Who may be excluded? In that view, budgets becomes moral documents. A budget tells us what government actually values. Because resources are limited, every allocation involves an opportunity cost. Money spent on one priority cannot simultaneously be spent somewhere else. The slide gives us useful tensions: military versus healthcare, infrastructure versus social protection, present need versus future investment. The point is not that one side is automatically correct. The point is that budgeting is ethical decision making at scale. A budget converts values into actual allocations. That's why we can even push this forward by saying there's such a thing as the ethics of prioritization. Government cannot do everything. Therefore, prioritization is unavoidable. The ethical question is not whether government prioritizes, but how priorities are determined. The slide proposes several criteria. Urgency: which harms are immediate? vulnerability, who is least able to protect themselves, scale, how many people are affected, rights, are fundamental rights involved, long-term impact. What will this decision mean for future generations? The point is to make these criteria explicit. That makes prioritization more defensible and even accountable. But let's look at another case, and the case we're talking about is the case of crisis governance. Why do we have to look at the case of crisis governance? Because crisis change the conditions under which government operates. Pandemics, wars, financial collapse, and severe disorder may require government to act quickly and expand executive authority. But crises create ethical dangers. Temporary powers may become permanent. Oversight may weaken. Fear may discourage criticism. So the simple principle is important. Emergency does not eliminate ethics, but intensifies it. The more extraordinary the power being exercised, the greater the need for ethical vigilance. This leads us to the ethics of emergency powers. When may government legitimately restrict liberty? The slide provides several standards: necessity, proportionality, legality, time limitation, reviewability, and least restrictive means. Necessity asks whether the restriction is genuinely required. Proportionality asks whether the response matches the threat. Legality requires proper authority. Time limitation prevents emergency measures from being permanent. Reviewability preserves oversight. And least restrictive means asks government to choose the option that limits rights the least. Emergency powers should therefore remain exemptional and temporary, not become the new normal. And that leads us to leadership under scrutiny or under certainty. Public administrators rarely possess perfect information. Evidence may be incomplete. Experts may disagree. Conditions may change. Resources may be limited. Ethical leadership, therefore, does not pretend to possess certainty. A responsible administrator should be able to say, this decision is based on the best evidence currently available, and we will revise it if better evidence emerges. Changing a decision because the evidence changed is not necessarily weakness. It can be a sign of intellectual humility and responsible governance. This leads us to digital governance or the concern of digital governance. Government increasingly operates digitally through online portals, digital IDs, electronic payments, mobile applications, facial recognitions, and predictive analytics. These technologies can improve efficiency, access, transparency, and service delivery. But digitalization does not automatically mean better governance. Technology can also create new forms of exclusion, surveillance, discrimination, and loss of privacy. So we must ask, we must ask, not only can technology make government faster, but also can we govern these technology ethically? Data is power. Government can now collect and combine enormous amounts of information about citizens, their transactions, movements, benefits, and other aspects of their lives. These can improve administration, but it can also become surveillance. The key ethical principle is data minimization. Collect only the information genuinely necessary for a legitimate public purpose. Just because government can collect information does not mean that government should collect it. That gives us an important principle for digital governance. Technological capability does not automatically create ethical permission. Let's look at discussions on algorithmic governance. We now move from simply collecting data to using algorithms to make or assist public decisions. Government agencies increasingly use algorithms in welfare eligibility, taxation, fraud detection, policing, risk assessment, and recruitment. Algorithm can certainly improve consistency and efficiency, but we must reject the idea that because something is mathematical, that it is already automatically neutral. Someone still decides what data will be used, what variables matter, what outcome are we trying to optimize, what level of error are we willing to accept. If historical data contains discrimination, an algorithm can reproduce that discrimination, not only now, faster, and at a much larger scale. So the important insight is this: technology does not remove values from decision making. It actually hides values inside code. When we design a system for efficiency rather than equity, that is already an ethical choice. Artificial intelligence and public administration. AI expands these possibilities even further. It can help government analyze documents, answer public inquiries, model policies, detect fraud, prepare administrative drafts, and support decision making. But the slide identifies three major ethical concerns. First is automation bias. We may trust the machine too easily. The dangerous sentence is the system said so. That cannot replace administrative judgment. Second is explainability. If government denies a benefit, rejects an application, or makes a decision affecting someone's employment or liberty, the citizen deserves to understand why. Third is human oversight. Humans must retain the capacity to question, review, override, and correct AI outputs. And oversight must be real. If the human reviewer does not understand what the system is doing, then human oversight becomes merely ceremonial. So, at this point, it's worth saying that responsibility cannot be outsourced. Suppose an automated system incorrectly denies a citizen a government benefit. Who is responsible? The programmer, the vendor, the agency, or the algorithm? Of course, the algorithm cannot bear moral responsibility. The institution remains answerable. Human designers establish objectives and inputs. Institutions decide to deploy the technology. Citizens receive the consequences. Therefore, the chain of accountability must remain intact. There must always be a person or institution capable of saying, we made this decision, we can explain it, and if it is wrong, we can correct it. AI should assist public responsibility, never become a mechanism for escaping it. Of course, there's also the question of digital divide and surveillance. Digital government may improve access for millions, but it can also exclude people. Consider citizens without reliable internet, smartphones, digital literacy, or those living in remote communities. Persons with disabilities may also encounter poorly designed systems. So if we say everything is online now, we may have improved efficiency while actually reducing accessibility. Digitization should expand access, not narrow it. Alternative pathways must remain available where necessary. The second issue is surveillance. Surveillance may have legitimate purposes, crime prevention, border protection, disaster response, but it also affects privacy, freedom, dissent, and democratic participation. Therefore, surveillance requires lawful authority, necessity, proportionality, oversight, and clear limits. The ethical question is not simply whether surveillance technology works. It, it is whether its use is justified. That leads us to questions on social media, disinformation, and public duty. Government communication has changed dramatically because public officials can communicate directly with citizens through social media. This creates speed and accessibility. but it also creates opportunities for misinformation, propaganda, manipulation, and the confusion of official government information with partisan political messaging. Disinformation is particularly dangerous because democracy requires some shared foundation of facts. Citizens may disagree about policies, but meaningful democratic debate becomes impossible if there is no agreement about basic reality. At the same time, government cannot use the fight against disinformation as an excuse to suppress legitimate criticism. So there are two dangers: falsehood on one side and censorship on the other. Public officials, therefore, have a special duty of truthfulness. Their words carry institutional authority, and when government makes a mistake, it should correct it openly. The willingness to correct oneself strengthens credibility. It does not necessarily weaken it. We also need to look at how all of these leads to polarization and democratic leadership. Ethical governance becomes more difficult in highly polarized societies because almost every decision is interpreted politically. Public administrators therefore face an important challenge. How do we serve an elected government without becoming instruments of political faction? Professional public service requires commitment to legality, evidence, fairness, and impartiality. This does not mean administrators have no values or political awareness. It means their fundamental orientation must remain toward the public, not toward partisan loyalty. The slide also contrasts democratic leadership with authoritarian efficiency. Democracy can be slower because it accepts participation, disagreement, deliberation, institutional limits, and rights. But those limitations are not necessarily weaknesses. In democracy, being constrained is part of legitimate leadership. A democratic leader accepts that power has boundaries. That's why this is always a question of participation and deliberation. Participation means giving citizens genuine opportunities to influence decisions. But participation can easily become symbolic. If government conducts a consultation after the decision has already been made, then the consultation is merely performance. But public hearings, surveys, community assemblies, participatory budgeting, and stakeholder dialogues become meaningful only when participation is timely and consequential. The slide then goes further and introduces deliberation. Deliberation is not simply asking, "What do you want?" It requires people to give reasons, listen, argue, reconsider, revise, and respond. Citizens are therefore not merely consumers of government services, they are participants in public reasoning. Finally, subsidiarity reminds us that decisions should normally be made at the lowest competent level because local communities possess knowledge that certain central institutions may lack. But decentralization must come with capacity and resources. Otherwise, we simply decentralize failure. Public service motivation and competence as duty. This brings us back to the public servant. Why do people enter government? There may be many reasons: job security, prestige, career opportunities, or a genuine service desire to serve. Public service motivation matters, but good intentions are not enough. The slide gives us a very useful formula: integrity plus competence. A person may be honest and compassionate, but still cause serious harm through incompetence. In public administration, competence therefore becomes an ethical duty. If your decisions affect people's lives, resources, rights, safety, or welfare, then you have an obligation to know what you are doing. That requires continuous learning, professional development, consultation with evidence, and intellectual humility. This is an important point. Ignorance is not always morally innocent when one has voluntarily accepted responsibility for others. This is very interesting because it will push us towards an evidence-based governance. We frequently say that government should be evidence-based. That is correct, but evidence-based cannot make every decision, even for us. Evidence tells us things such as what happened, what intervention works, what outcomes are likely. But evidence cannot by itself tell us what goals should society pursue, what risks are morally acceptable, what rights should never be sacrificed merely for efficiency. Those require ethical and political judgment. So we should remember the formula. Every evidence informs ethics, it does not replace it. And the slide identifies two extremes: experience without expertise, without democracy, risks paternalism. Experts deciding everything for citizens. But populism without expertise risks incompetence, making decisions without sufficient knowledge. Ethical governance requires a dialogue between expert knowledge and democratic judgment. This leads us to institutional learning. Ethical institutions must actually learn or must be learning institutions. They evaluate programs, review failures, invite feedback, and preserve institutional memory. This requires a different attitude toward mistakes. If every mistake immediately becomes a search for someone to blame, people will learn to hide problems. And once an organization begins hiding mistakes, it loses the ability to learn from them. That is why after action review is important. We ask what happened, what worked, what failed, why did it fail, and what should we change next time. Accountability remains necessary when there is negligence or wrongdoing. But not every failure is misconduct. Sometimes failure is information. A mature ethical institution, therefore, asks not only who is responsible, but also what must the institution learn so that this does not happen again. That connects us back to the central theme of the entire lecture. Ethical governance is not about creating perfect institutions. It's about creating institutions capable of accountability, correction, learning, and improvement. That's why we need to be able to distinguish a learning culture versus a blame culture. We ended the previous slide by saying that ethical institutions must learn. But whether an institution actually learns depends greatly on how it responds when something goes wrong. The slide contrasts two organizational cultures, blame culture and learning culture. In a blame culture, the first question is usually who made the mistake. Employees quickly learn that admitting error is dangerous. As a result, mistakes are hidden, information is withheld, and problems are quietly passed to someone else. The irony is that a culture supposedly designed to create accountability can actually destroy accountability. A learning culture asks a different set of questions. What happened? Why did it happen? Was this an honest error, negligence, recklessness, or misconduct? Or what should we change? These distinctions matter. Not every mistake deserves punishment, but neither should every mistake be excused. So, ethical administration requires just accountability, serious enough to address wrongdoing, but safe enough to allow people to report genuine mistakes. Here you see institutional courage and humility. We usually speak about courage and humility as personal virtues, but institutions can possess or lack these virtues as well. Institutional courage means being willing to confront uncomfortable truths, admitting systemic problems, protecting whistleblowers, publishing difficult audit findings, confronting powerful interests, and visibly correcting failed policies. An institution becomes ethically weak when protecting its reputation becomes more important than discovering the truth. But courage must be accompanied by institutional humility. Government must recognize that it cannot solve every problem. Sometimes government should regulate, sometimes it should provide services, but sometimes its role is to support communities, civil society, professionals, families, or local institutions that may be better positioned to respond. Humility, therefore, means knowing the limits of administrative power. The ethical institution must be capable of saying both. We have a responsibility to act and This is not something government should control completely. There's also the idea of intergenerational justice. We we now introduce another dimension of ethical governance: time. Public administration usually deals with people who are present now: citizens, taxpayers, voters, communities, stakeholders. But many government decisions affect people who do not yet exist or who currently have no political voice. Consider public debt, environmental degradation, infrastructure, education, climate adaptation, and natural resources. Future generations cannot vote today. They cannot attend consultations. They cannot protest. They cannot lobby government. Yet they will inherit the consequences of today's decision. This creates a special ethical responsibility. Ethical governance must somehow represent those who cannot yet represent themselves. So the question becomes not simply what do citizens want today? We must also ask, what are we leaving to citizens of tomorrow? That's why we need to be confronted with the temptation of short-termism. One of the greatest pressures in government is short-termism. Politically, short-term achievements are attractive. A project can be inaugurated, a building can be photographed, statistics can be announced, credit can be claimed, but ethical governance must consider life cycle costs. Imagine building expensive infrastructure without allocating sufficient resources for maintenance. The administration receives credit today, but future administrations inherit deterioration and debt. This is the tension between electoral time and generational time. Political leaders may think in 3, 6 year cycles, but climate change, democratic shifts, educational reform, institutional trust, and environmental sustainability may require decades. Therefore, one of the most important questions for ethical leadership is, what will this decision mean 20 years from now? Good governance is not simply government that performs well today. It is government that does not purchase people towards success with tomorrow's failure. Let's apply this framework to some cases. And here we look at the case of the digital welfare system. Suppose government introduces an AI-supported welfare eligibility system. Processing becomes faster and fraud detection improves. From an efficiency perspective, the program looks successful. But then officials discover unusually high rejection rates in remote communities because the algorithm relies heavily on digital records and rural records are incomplete. Now we see why efficiency cannot be our only ethical standard. National statistics may show success while particular communities experience systemic injustice. We therefore ask, who is responsible? The programmer, the agency, the administrators who accepted the recommendations, the legislature that authorized the system. We also need human override and appeal mechanisms. The fundamental lesson is efficiency without equity can become technological justice. A system is not ethical because it processes cases quickly. We must also examine who is being incorrectly excluded. Let's go to the second data set. And this is the data set on the public health database. This concerns a proposed public health database combining medical, travel, and identification records. There are clear benefits during a pandemic, an epidemic. Integrated information could make contact tracing faster and targeting more accurate. But the same infrastructure creates enormous surveillance capacity. So we return to necessity. What data are actually necessary? There's a difference between information that is necessary and information that is merely useful or convenient. Then we ask about access, who can search the database, retention, how long will the information remain, contestability, what happens if government's information about me is wrong, and finally deletion, what happens to extraordinary data systems after the emergency ends. The guiding principle is data minimization. Build the smallest data architecture necessary to achieve the legitimate public purpose. Right protections should not be added after after problems occur. They should be designed into the systems from the beginning. Of course, there are more cases here to reflect on infrastructure projects, the case of a political appointee, the case of an embarrassing audit, and we now go to slide 50, building an ethical institution. We now reach the constructive part of the lecture. After discussing ethics, power, leadership, trust, accountability, integrity, technology, participation, competence, and institutional learning, the question becomes, how do we actually build an ethical institution? The slide gives us a central principle. Ethical institutions are designed, not inherited. We cannot simply hope that every future leader will be virtuous. Institutions must deliberately build ethics into their mission, people's processes, oversight, and culture. That means clear institutional purposes, merit-based recruitment, appropriate checks and balances, accountability mechanisms, data protection, meaningful participation, and evaluation. These takes us back to the central question of the entire week 4 lecture. And what is that? How do we build institutions that remain ethical even when individual leaders change? The real achievement of ethical leadership is therefore not merely I governed ethically while I was in office. The greater achievement is I helped create an institution in which ethical action became more likely even after I was gone. That that is the transition from ethical leadership to ethical governance. Let's look at the 15 features of an ethical institution. This makes the discussion very concrete. If we say that an ethical institution what should we actually look for? And the slide identifies 15 features: clear mission, merit-based recruitment, ethical leadership, transparent procedures, conflict of interest safeguards, independent oversight, safe reporting, accessible complaint systems, evidence-based decision-making, continuing ethics education, regular audits, inclusive participation, protection of dissent, data protection, and meaningful evaluation. Notice that ethics appear throughout the organization. It's not confined to an ethics committee or a code of conduct. Recruitment is ethical. Procurement is ethical. Data management is ethical. Evaluation is ethical. Even the way an institution treats disagreement is ethical. The key insight is ethics must become part of the architecture of the institution. This leads us, of course, to a next discussion on ethics training and moral imagination. Ethics training should not simply teach employees a list of prohibited acts. Of course, public servants need to know the rules, but difficult administrative problems rarely arrive with a label saying this is an ethical dilemma. Good ethics training, therefore, develops judgment. It uses cases, simulations, discussion, and reflective practice so that administrators learn how to reason under pressure. The slide also introduces moral imagination. Sometimes we think ethical decision making means choosing between option A and option B, but what if both are bad? The leader should ask, is there another way of framing the problem? Is there a third option? Moral imagination means refusing to accept unnecessary, narrow choices. Now, let's look at anticipatory ethics and ethics by design. Of course, much of ethics is reactive. Something bad happens, we investigate. Then we create a rule so that it will not happen again. That is necessary, but the damage has already occurred. Anticipatory ethics asks a better question. What could go wrong before we implement this policy or technology? This is particularly important for AI surveillance, biotechnology, and predictive systems. Then we move to ethics by design. Instead of adding safeguards after implementation, we build them into the system from the beginning. Appeal mechanisms, separation of procurement functions, data minimization, monitoring, and review. The principle is simple. Do not bolt ethics onto the system afterward. Build ethics into the system from the start. Now we return to discussions of leadership. A good leader must eventually ask, who comes after me? Ethical leaders prepare successors. They mentor people, create opportunities for growth, document processes, decentralize expertise, and preserve institutional memory. If everything collapses when the leader leaves, then something was missing institutionally. This gives us a different understanding of legacy. Legacy is not simply buildings, programs, or projects bearing our names. The better questions are, is the institution fairer? Is it stronger? Is it more competent? Is it more transparent and humane? That is the ethical measure of leadership. Now, let's look at a personal philosophy of public leadership. At the doctoral level, you should eventually be able to articulate your own philosophy of public leadership. The slide proposes four foundations: human dignity, public trust, justice and accountability, and institutional responsibility. Human dignity means that decisions must be evaluated according to their effects on persons, especially those with the least power. Public trust means remembering that power is held in trust, not in ownership. Justice requires accountability because authority without answerability becomes mere power. And institutional responsibility reminds us that leaders are temporary stewards of organizations that should outlive them. So, your philosophy of leadership should ultimately answer the question, what do I believe public power is for? This leads us to the 10 foundations of 10 foundational principles. Let's look at the 10 foundational principles here. So there are 10 principles of ethical public leadership, and let's look at them now. No, public power is entrusted, not owned. Authority exists for the common good. Human dignity must be respected. Leaders must be answerable. Integrity requires consistency. Competence is an ethical responsibility. Institutions must be stronger than personalities. Transparency should be normal and secrecy justified. The vulnerable deserves particular attention, and ethical leaders prepare institutions to remain ethical after they leave. If we reduce all 10 to one idea, it is this: public office is stewardship. You temporarily exercise authority that ultimately exists for others. Now let's move forward and look at the synthetic model of ethical public leadership. We now synthesize the entire course. The slide tells us that ethical public leadership consists of 5 interlocking dimensions and that no single dimension is sufficient by itself. This is important because we sometimes reduce ethical leadership to character. We say find honest people. Yes, but honest people working within dysfunctional institutions may accomplish very little. At the very same time, excellent institutions without people of integrity can become empty bureaucratic structures. So we need to think relationally. Good persons, competent administration, good institutions, accountability, and public purpose must work together. And that basically leads us to discussions on ethical governance, on the ethical leadership equation. I hope you just bear with me. As you see, we're almost there. Uh, so just hold on, no? Of course, you also might have noticed I could have, took me very long time discussing these ones, but I'm just discussing a 65 set of slides in more or less 2 hours or less than 2 hours. So the slide expresses the entire course as an equation. Ethical governance is equivalent to character plus competence plus just institutions plus accountability plus public purpose. Remove character and people learn how to manipulate the rules. Remove competence and good intentions may still produce harm. Remove institutions and everything depends upon whoever happens to be in power. Remove accountability and authority becomes dangerous. Remove public purpose and leadership becomes self-serving. So ethical governance requires all five. This is perhaps the simplest framework to remember. Now, let's look at your final course exercise. Of course, this is just a classroom exercise, not really what your paper will be about. But here you can see already the leadership philosophy paper is what I will eventually demand. So this exercise asks you to complete several statements. Public power should exist in order to, a public leader must never, the greatest ethical danger in government is, citizens have the right to expect, institutions become corrupt when, leadership becomes legitimate when law and conscience conflict and administrators should, and the legacy I would want to leave in public is. Do not treat these as examination questions. Treat them as the beginnings of your personal philosophy of public leadership. Your answer reveals what you actually believe about authority, responsibility, citizens, and service. Now we can see the entire course as one architecture. Week 1, ethics, what is right. Week 2, power, who can shape reality. Week 3, leadership, how should power be exercised. Week 4, governance, how can ethical power become institutional practice. These are not 4 topics that we study separately and then forget. Every administrative decision contains all 4. So when you make a decision, you're making an ethical judgment, exercising power, demonstrating a form of leadership, and contributing to a pattern of governance. That is why public administration is never merely technical. In fact, public leadership is stewardship. It's not a possession, not entitlement, but responsibility. Not domination, but service. Not self-preservation, but institution building. These changes how we understand authority. The ethical leader does not ask, what can I do with my power? The better question is, what am I responsible for because this power has temporarily been entrusted to me? Public power is temporary. Institutions endure. Allow me to end with 5 excellent questions for reflection. First, can I do this? That is the legal question. Do I possess the authority? Second, should I do this? That's the ethical question. What do justice, dignity, and common good require? Third, who will be affected? That is the accountability question. Who benefits and who bears the cost? Fourth, can I defend this before the public? That is the transparency question. And finally, What institution will exist because I chose this way? That is the legacy question. These 5 questions take us beyond simple compliance. Something may be legal and still be unwise, unjust, unnecessary, or institutionally destructive. This leads us to the highest expression of ethical leadership. What happens when the leader leaves? The highest expression of ethical leadership is being able to say the institution can continue serving the public well even when I am gone. Weak leadership creates dependence. Strong ethical leadership creates capacity. So perhaps we should change the question from what kind of leader do I want to become to what kind of institution will exist because I once led within it. That moves us away from personal ambition toward institutional and generational responsibility. This sentence summarizes the course. Public leadership is ethical when power is exercised with competence, justice, humility, accountability, and sustained commitment to institutions that protect human dignity and serve the common good. Notice that ethics here is not simply honesty. It includes competence because incompetence harms people. It includes justice because public power must be fair. It includes humility because power has limits. It includes accountability because authority must remain answerable. And finally, it includes institution building because leadership should leave something good behind. That that is ethical public leadership. It's a broken slide, which means I'll have to bring it back to where we all began. The slide introduces doctoral discussion questions, and the purpose is to move beyond merely describing theories toward at critical reflection and synthesis. Let me just close the slide because anyway, sira. At the doctoral level, the important question is no longer simply what did Kant say, or what did Weber say, or what is accountability, or what is good governance. Those are foundations. The deeper task is to ask what happens when these principles coincide in actual government. What happens when legality conflicts with conscience, or when efficiency conflicts with equity, when political loyalty conflicts with professional competence, or when transparency conflicts with legitimate confidentiality, when technology increases administrative capacity but threatens dignity and privacy? That is where ethical leadership actually begins. Not when the answer is obvious, but when legitimate values are in tension. And that is perhaps the final lesson for DPA 702. Ethical public leadership is not simply knowing what is right. It is developing the character, the competence, the judgment, and the institutional courage to pursue what is right while exercising real power under real conditions and leaving the institution better than you found it. Thank you very much for listening and have a nice day, everyone.